So this is an excerpt from a novel called The Orchard, and what you need to know is it takes place in 1933 in the Sacramento Valley. The character you're going to hear here is Django, and he's a migrant worker from Oklahoma, and he has a young teenage son named Terrell. Terrell cut and coursed, full of his immortal youth, dogged, and Django at the strike called his name, and he was always moving forward. Nobody was ever going to touch him. Terrell was so far in front of him, seeming blind with his first taste of manhood, swept between shadows of dust inside the storm of men, a graceful, long-limbed man-boy, clever in his way, but oh, not nearly, not ever as clever as men with money and guns. Django called out, and he wanted to be there to hold him back, but the swell of the angry men at the strike, and the warm, acrid scent of guns just fired, and the hot dust he sucked down his lungs, and his boy's dark blood percolating from his perforated heart, just as the dust that tempested up from the over-dried Oklahoma ground had been too stifling and too strong. The stampede of men wouldn't stop for Django that night, but he found his boy alive, briefly, staring up at the man, and time stood still, and the man was gunning and purposeful and mean. Every look, every breath was for him alone. "Back up or else," said the man. He's not afraid of the man, those words, Django's bankrupt picker's back, the way he can't stop feeling it, imagining himself, a white-tailed deer shot through the spine, still alive, all his innards in one clean slice lightly lifted out of him, his hands two captive birds fluttering upwards out of harm's way, signaling to the man his intent was pure, and the bleeding boy mattered more than his hastily caged rage. Kneeling at the side of his son, succumbing to enveloping ground, touching the lips of Terrell's last gasp, he lightly lifted the bloody body of his firstborn son to his breast, and the barrel of the shotgun shone in the firelit night, and he rose up from the swirls of dust, the gun smoke, the cries of men, a hailing of vacancy in his ears, the face of the man the only sound, like a country tune a traveling band had taught him as a child, sung in the round, the thing he remembered. He forged a trail through the hay-colored knee-high grass for his family to follow through. He could hear the steady swish of their skirts and legs as they brushed against the grass. He kept his eyes trained on the clump of trees ahead rather than look directly at the limp and bloodied body of his son. With every step Django took, Terrell's legs and loose arm, his bent back head bobbed like a misused rag doll. Estelle had cleaned his face and hands and body as best she could with the unclean ditch water, but the blood and dirt stayed in his hair, his ripped and shredded shirt caked with scab-brown blood. Django's biceps cramped with the effort of carrying his son's dead weight, his dead boy. His sweat-dampened shirt stuck to his back, sweat sting dripping into his eyes. Then he saw them, the others, coming from the Hooverville shacks and tents and lean-tos, a line of people walking through the grass, not one or two or a few, but dozens. The bedraggled masses that he'd secretly disdained when he'd seen them lined up for jobs or camped on the side of the road, when he thought them pathetic and held on to the idea of himself as a generational farmer, simply down on his luck, not vagrants like they were. They were coming to help him. He was no better for having once owned his own farm rather than be a tenant farmer, or being from Oklahoma rather than from Arkansas, or driving a Ford rather than a Willie. He was one of them. He and his family were no different. They were them. Django couldn't continue. He placed Terrell on the foot-trampled earth as if he were tucking him into bed, Estelle came and stood with him, holding Esther's hand in one of her own and Thelma's in the other. Theo leaned against Django's curved back and hugged him with his thin arms and little boy hands. The others came, stood a respectful distance away. Two ash-faced men entered the family circle with a weather-beaten plank of wood. They laid Terrell's body on it and carried him between them towards the trees. Not a word was spoken. It was simply done. Django rose and lifted his young son Theo onto his shoulders and, surrounded by strangers and neighbors both, Django's family followed their firstborn boy to his gravesite, and their tears wet the dust-dry earth. And 3 red-necked turkey vultures circled the site. 7 more from the trees waited there. Haunting they were, not small at all, but solid shadows in the gloom, fluttering with hunger and patience. From the camp had come men and women and children grieving for the dead boy, known to most by sight and fervency, passing out flyers to strike, and not by name until the part-time preacher read it out loud over his grave, dug in hurried scrapes of metal to dry earth and piled with creek rocks and a hastily nailed cross. Stifled by sorrows of their own dug up out of not long ago memories, mourners shuffled their feet, dirt, dust, grit, soil, and wouldn't leave the grief-stricken gloaming. A child in a worn white dress floated through the tangle of mourners, torn sheer by last light, airy and free, loosed by the wind, waving. She had in her hand a single flower, an offering, and held out to Estelle the ripped stem, grimed, wilted, a twinkle of yellow brightness against the gray dirt, gray clothes, gray-skinned folks churning the dust up through vultured branches, up to the sun's blood-dyed sky. Estelle took the daisy and could not look at the child. She could cry. Heave, shake, weep, the sound running like rain on droughted fields. Django hummed a lullaby to calm her, lightly lifted Estelle's hand to his own lips so his wife could feel it there, the last breath of Terrell's last day resolving. Thank you.